Welcome to this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. And each week, we tackle a handful of the biggest questions that we're hearing about globally, from data centers, critical infrastructure, critical facilities, regardless of where you sit on the go-to-market team. Perhaps you work in sales, marketing, account management, product, channel partnerships, or maybe you're the executive sponsor, the leader who's responsible for getting together, recruiting the right people into the right roles so they play their musical instruments at the right time, at the right tempo, just the right volume to be able to create that magic symphony of growth, regardless of whether your company is a data center operator like colocation, wholesale, hyperscale, edge, or modular, or maybe you do something related to data center technology or data center facilities, or perhaps you're all in on data center construction, real estate and investment, or maybe your company is involved in some way, shape, or form with outsourced sales and marketing in and around data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. If this is the first time that you're joining us for Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, welcome. We're thrilled to have you with us. If you are a frequent flyer, if you've been with us before, welcome back. We're thrilled to have you with us as well. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational and events and resources just like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox on Sundays. You can sign up for free on our website at www.dcsmi.com. So what is on the agenda for this week's show? First up, we're going to talk about how a major co-location data center operator attracts new logos. After that, we'll turn our attention to how a sustainable, modular, and scalable edge data center provider can improve its marketing. After that, we'll shift our attention to how a data center infrastructure, VC, venture capital investment firm, finds early adopters for new technologies. That'll put us right at the halfway point, and we'll take a real quick break at that point for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about hyperscale operators, and in particular, how hyperscale data center operators effectively acquire clients. Next, we'll look at a aspect of data center facilities that we really don't get to talk about that much: flooring, raised flooring. So in this particular case, the question is, how can a data center raised flooring company improve its sales and marketing messages? And as we head down the home stretch on this week's show, our final topic that we'll look at this week is how a data center digital marketing and communications agency can build data center community awareness. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think that we should address on an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you like to watch from. And without any further delay, let's jump into this week's first question. What do we got? This one is about co-location operators. By the way, before we get too far into this week's show, if you're watching live, please let us know in the comments where you're joining us from and what you do in the data center industry. So first question up is, how can a major co-location data center operator attract new logos? So your company is a colo operator, and you're a major colo operator, meaning that when you look at like ranking lists, whether it's by revenue, whether it's by employee headcount, whether it's by the amount of square footage or square meters under management, or most often, whether it's by the megawatts, if you're considered a major colocation operator, how would you go about attracting new logos? That's a fantastic question, because major colocation operators have a different way of attracting net new clients, net new enterprise clients, than mid-size and certainly smaller data center operators. So when When you think about the logos that you're likely looking for as a chief revenue officer or senior vice president of sales or chief commercial officer or something like that for a major co-location operator, probably at this point a major global co-location operator who does business in multiple countries. When it comes to attracting net new logos, you probably have a pretty well-defined idea of where you want those logos to be coming from. For large companies, this may be talked about somewhat at the board level, especially for really large, significant logo kinds of accounts. For like mid-sized clients, again, it depends on what the revenue concentration is. It depends on how many megawatts they're taking. It depends on how much square footage they're taking. Depends on how high profile they are. Depends on whether you can talk about the fact that you have that client as a logo, because we know among huge parts of the data center ecosystem, you can have them as a client, but your lips are sealed about your ability to talk about them. So as long as you have the ability to talk about the fact that they are a logo client, the fact that they are leasing space from you, then they're likely up on your website. Their logo is on your website. And perhaps it's in other places like sales decks and similar kinds of marketing and sales collateral points. So when we're looking for how to attract more just like that, we're looking for what those logos tend to have in common. Geographically, do they tend to be headquartered all in the same region? Do they have operations in multiple regions? Are they on one continent? Are they on multiple continents? So geographically, where are they located? Second, how many facilities do they tend to have their servers? They tend to have their racks. They tend to have physical presence in your location. So in other words, they may be headquartered in one country. They may have operations in, say, 6 countries. And among those 6 countries, maybe there's 21 different locations. For those 21 different locations that they do business, how many different locations are they in with your company? How many different facilities? So that certainly can help flesh out the geographic part of your ideal client profile for attracting new logos. Next is, what's the size? Like, with having product market fit and go to market fit, you for sure know the amount of revenue that they're generating for you, the amount of power that they're consuming, the amount of space that they're taking up, that they're leasing. However, this is the big however, at some point to look at where you've been most successful and turn that over to your VP of sales and your sales directors for actionable plans, you're going to want to normalize that for the kinds of parameters, the kinds of specs that someone can put into a prospecting database. Like, to keep it super simple, let's just say we're talking about LinkedIn Sales Navigator. There's no magic filter on LinkedIn Sales Navigator for square footage or megawatts of power that's consumed, but there is a very, very accessible filter parameter that you can use to narrow down your searches by headcount, by amount of employees in this company. And as it turns out, LinkedIn isn't unique. Most of the prospecting databases that you'd have subscriptions to would also normalize around number of employees, amount of headcount. So when it comes to your ideal client profile and looking for new logos, what's too small and what's too big? When it comes to logos for a lot of major data center operators, there more than likely is not an upper limit where you're putting a ceiling on it and saying, hey, they're so big that we just can't solve what they're looking for today. That is for sure a reality with a lot of smaller co-location operators that have just a handful of locations, or may just be 1 or 2 locations where they're owner operated. It's a few dozen employees. So it makes sense a lot of times in that kind of context where they say, hey, we're outside of our comfort zone if the company is bigger than 5,000 employees or bigger than 1,000 employees or something like that. For a major co-location operator, it's actually the opposite scenario. You may actually be in your most comfort zone when they're huge, when they're 10,000 plus employees. So it's more a matter of, for a major colo operator, is your sign-up process, is your onboarding process, or your unit economics such that really any size company can come to you, even if they just need a piece of a rack. If they're just putting a couple servers in your facility, or do you have minimums for the minimum lease size, for the minimum that they can contract with you for. And if that's the case, you likely over time have developed an idea that says, hey, look, we'd like to work with small companies, but our version of a small company is they need to have at least 50 employees, or they need to have at least 200 employees or something like that. So that would put a floor on even if there's no ceiling, that would put a floor on the minimum size they need to be to afford your minimums relative to your ideal client profile. The third part of your ideal client profile for a major colo operator may be certain industries where you do better than others. And for major colocation operators, it's very likely that you've invested in all or nearly all of the most popular certifications, accreditations, compliance requirements in all of the geographic markets where you're located in, but you may not. So if there are certain credentials that you have that make you ideally suited in various regions and various locations for certain kinds of industries, for sure, that should be included in your ideal client profile in your ICP. If conversely, there's a couple of industries that you really can't work with because you have not achieved that credentialing, that should also be listed in your ideal client profile as an exclusion. And that for sure will come up when you're doing your filtering criteria in your prospect databases. If you're running ads in something like LinkedIn Ads, LinkedIn Campaign Manager, for sure, it will factor very largely in placing drop-down lists in your lead generation forms, where both the inclusions and the exclusions are there, and the inclusions gets priority and the exclusions gets disqualified for all intents and purposes. And that same industry plus geography plus company size is something that you'll almost certainly use in your CRM and your customer relationship management system and your email marketing and your marketing tech and your sales tech across the board to determine who's qualified, who's unqualified, whether you route to sales immediately, whether you send them back for nurturing, or a little bit of spread around a couple of different areas. The other big place where that preferable industries versus unpreferable industries tends to come up with your ideal client profile is when you're planning your website copywriting. In other words, if you have 5 industries where you as a major data center operator have done phenomenally well and continue to do really, really well, each of those 5 industries more than likely has its own go-to-market, has its own sales and marketing playbook. You more than likely, at this stage of the game as a major data center operator, have segmented up your marketing teams so that you have specialists in each of those 5 verticals. Say, for argument's sake, maybe it's like manufacturing, telecommunications, hospitality, financial services, healthcare, government, something like that. So you hire account executives, account managers, sales development reps, marketers that have hyper specialized expertise in those verticals and in those industries. So you have talent. And then the next step is each of those likely gets a minimum of its own website page on your core website, on your main top and bottom navigation. It likely has its own set of lead generation funnels, lead generation premium content offers for the full journey. It likely has its own webinar series, may have its own podcast. For sure, that ICP, that ideal client profile, dictates how much real estate certain industries, certain kinds of buyers get on your homepage. It's for certain impacts not only the website copywriting, but product marketing, sales enablement, email marketing, social media strategy, events, online events like webinars and streams and virtual events, as well as offline events. It plays huge roles in what you choose to do with segmenting and pursuing these logos. Now, at a high level, because you mentioned that you're from a major co-location operator, you have a huge advantage that sales and marketing folks from mid-size and smaller operators just simply don't have. You can lean on your company's brand, meaning that when you have a presence at a major conference, or when you send out an email marketing campaign, or you run ads or put up social media posts, it's far more likely that a huge amount of your addressable market, your ideal client profile, already has heard of your company, is already familiar with your brand. And in a perfect world, most of the people that have heard of your brand will have a favorable impression of your brand, as opposed to the opposite or somewhere in the middle. But that said, as a major co-location operator, that's a major competitive advantage that you have. that said, there could be some places where you may not be as strong, like being flexible, being agile, with a average to mid-sized client, having direct access to your CEO and CTO, like literally having their mobile numbers if something goes wrong, where it's probably not very likely if you have hundreds or thousands of co-location clients as a major colo. So there's definitely advantages and disadvantages that you have that helps you attract new logos. One of my first jobs that I had in the IT world is while I was in college, I worked for IBM through what most people today would consider a PEO, a professional employer organization. Was actually run by Manpower, the huge personnel employment service. So they had a contract nationally with IBM to staff up campus representatives to market, sell, evangelize early generation PCs and Windows to higher education, to college professors, college faculty, college students. And at the time, and this probably still to a certain degree, there used to be an expression at the time of nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. If that resonates with you, by the way, let me know in the comments. I'd love to know. If you remember hearing at some point in your career, nobody ever got fired for IBM, you know the value of having a blue chip brand. Ironically, by the time IBM had exited the 1990s, they were pretty much out of the PC business. And what's left of that today are the assets that they sold off, spun off to Lenovo. So when you look at like a ThinkPad that you could still purchase today as a laptop, I remember when I was working for IBM during college, the original ThinkPads actually came up. So anyway, when we talk about people's risk aversion, and you think about the huge data center operators in our industry, like Digital Realty, Equinix, NTT Global Data Centers, there's easily 5, 6, 7 very, very well-known global ones. Then there's ones that are under the umbrella, under portfolio companies like DigitalBridge has Vantage and DataBank, and it's a bunch of very, very well-known data center operators throughout the US and globally that have massive presence. And those are what most people would consider as the major data center operators. And they have unique opportunities because they have brands that have literally hundreds of millions or billions in revenue, and brand value, brand equity that is commensurate with that. But there's also disadvantages. So when it comes to attracting new logos, their account executives, their marketers, their sales development reps don't have to work nearly as hard as sales and marketing teams from small and mid-size operators. So they a lot of times can go to a major conference, invest a couple $100,000 into that conference, and do a reasonably good job with their sales team attracting new logos directly into their pipeline because they already had a massive, massive head start over a period of several years and literally thousands of impressions with thousands or tens of thousands of people in the marketplace. If you're from a smaller company, you don't have that same kind of running head start. So you need to be a lot more deliberate about your ideal client profile, your targeting, figuring out your buyer personas, getting your messaging right, your segmentation, your personalization, and most of all, thriving in today's self-driven buyer's journey. So overall, yeah, a lot of the same basics apply for attracting new logos, regardless of your company size. You still need clarity on your ideal client profile because you have so much deeper resources. You're probably segmenting your sales team into deeply niche specialists a lot more. Like I mentioned before, it's super common throughout the data center industry today to find industry specific specializations, vertical specializations. Some companies will continue to segment by deal size as well, where there's enterprise sales reps, there's mid-market sales reps, and there's SMB. On the low end of SMB, we increasingly see a lot of the data center operators wanting to actively walk away from that kind of business because the unit economics don't add up because the deal sizes are so small. And they're not totally walking away from it. They're just investing in self-service sign-up, which feels a lot more like e-commerce, self-provisioning, self-onboarding, or they're allowing their channel partners to take over those parts of the market. But when it comes to logos, when it comes to mid-market and enterprise, yeah, we're seeing this increasing specialization by vertical where you're hiring people that come into those roles already having deep expertise and a deep network of professional relationships that they built up throughout their course of their career. So not only do they have that deep institutional knowledge in those relationships, but they can enter that kind of conversation, not from being seen as a vendor, a co-location vendor. They're seen a lot more like a consultant, a subject matter expert, a trusted advisor, a teacher who can provide unique insights to their prospects and clients about how other companies similar to that prospect or that client have approached figuring out digital infrastructure goals, digital infrastructure challenges that align with investing in a relationship with a co-location operator. So yeah, it's still the ideal client profile. It's still figuring out the buyer personas. It's still understanding, once you prioritize the buyer personas, who's got the strongest economic impact, what the biggest goals and challenges that are going on in their world, how you can create all of your digital client-facing content and events to provide solutions, to provide answers around those biggest goals and challenges that your prioritized buyer personas have articulated in their word. And the idea of trying to earn your way in as early as possible, as often as possible, so you can really shape the criteria that those logos, those prospects that could be potential new logo clients for you, how they're going to decide what they're ultimately going to do with solving this technology, solving this business, solving this infrastructure related problem. That's a leading indicator that they're going to be in market for co-location in the coming weeks or in the coming months. So yes, it's different for a major co-location operator because your brand is so much more well-known than a much smaller co-location operator. That said, many times you may not be able to move as quickly because there's a lot more approvals, a lot more coordination that needs to happen internally. There's a lot more restrictions on what you can and can't say with all of that. So yeah, there's pros and cons with all of this, with balancing having your own professional brand, having your team's brand, having your company's brand. But at the end of the day, it's a lot of it is still educating and building trust with the right people in the right places, in the right time, and most of all in the right context. And in some cases, because your prospects and clients know of your brand, because it's so well known, you might be able to call in sick on the awareness and the consideration stages of the buyer's journey and just show up at the end and do okay. But that's not normally how data center operators are able to thrive in today's hyper-competitive marketplace. If you want to make sure that you're not leaving yourself, your company, and your team vulnerable to losing deals, it is incredibly important that you figure out a way to be involved in that full journey. And in most cases, it's getting out of the vendor box and having you and your team be seen a lot more like experts, a lot more like trusted advisors. So your most important personas are highly motivated to want to spend a lot of time with you throughout their full journey. So yeah, I'm sure you're still going to invest aggressively in golf tournaments and cocktail parties and swag and a whole bunch of really expensive branding that may or may not have any impact whatsoever on return on investment. And you can afford to do that as a major co-location operator because you have a lot of resources at your disposal. But at the end of the day, when you're talking about selling to skeptical, cynical, highly technical, highly educated IT decision makers, they want that self-driven journey. They want to be in the driver's seat, and we have to work extra hard to earn our way back in to be seen as teachers and consultants. And yeah, playing golf with you can be fun, but are you really educating and building trust? Are you educating and building trust with them at the hospitality suite, at the baseball game or the football game that you took them to? You're trusting, you're certainly building your brand, but are you really educating them, empowering them to be a great internal champion about this initiative that you're working with them on? Because a lot of being the account executive today is exactly that. It's working with your internal champion to be a fantastic project manager to help him or her drive alignment with their coworkers, drive alignment across their team, drive alignment across other teams within the company, and basically making sure that the two of you are partnering together to have the right kind of coverage, the right kind of service area across the full decision committee. So those are some of the considerations that I would look at for how a major co-location data center operator attracts net new logos. I think there really is a huge danger in being a market share leader and being an incumbent to keep doing what you've always done and ignoring some of the reality that we're in a very different buyer's journey than we were 10 years ago. And for a while, you may be able to get away with that, but just understand that you're hungrier, more aggressive, more nimble, more agile competitors coming from mid-size and smaller co-location operators are likely moving faster and even more aggressively about trying to be seen as teachers and consultants and subject matter experts and trusted advisors. They're reacting a lot more quickly to the understanding that 83% of the typical journey now happens without you in the room. And yeah, for a while, if you work for one of the major data center operators, you may be able to ignore a little bit of that, but at some point there for sure is a vulnerability, because there are companies, when they see a logo from a company like yours, react positively. A lot of people, probably many of the people, will react positively, and there'll be some people that have had negative experiences with the major data center operators and have a never again kind of mindset, where they go to the other extreme, where they want a relationship with a co-location operator where, relative to their financial value to that firm, they want direct access to a CTO, perhaps even direct access to a CEO. And in a smaller company, they may get exactly that. So those are some of the things to think about for how a major co-location data center operator can attract net new logos. Okay, what do we have up next? Okay, next question. This is from a edge data center provider, which is another kind of data center operator, kind of the first cousin of co-location operators, and that edge tends to be hyper-focused on the precise location where they are, and often wins deals because of that precise location, because of distance, proximity, latency, governance. They tend to be smaller. And again, the owners, the investors in edge, tend to be a lot more focused on not just presence in a particular geographic region, but presence at a very specific location in a very specific city or postal code or metropolitan area or suburbs. So anyway, so how can a sustainable, modular, and scalable edge data center provider improve its marketing? So the edge data center provider, from a positioning standpoint, is positioning themselves as sustainable, meaning focused on green related issues, environmental, social governance kind of issues, modular edge data centers, and scalable edge data centers. So scalable, typically in the context of edge, means that you have a lot of different edge locations, and you're making it possible for clients to be able to kind of connect the dots on those edge locations to provide them with a lot more capacity, a lot more locations. Using the word modular with edge can potentially be a little bit confusing, because modular data centers and edge data centers are actually two completely different things. A modular data center is like a data center that's built in something that looks like a cargo shipping container that you would see go on a freighter crossing the ocean or on a railroad car or something like that. And in some cases, for lower budget kind of setups, you're literally using that kind of skeleton. In other cases, it just kind of bears a little bit of resemblance there. Looks a little bit like a prefab manufactured building, looks a little bit like a RV or truck or tour bus or something like that. In other words, it's meant to be totally portable, with the idea that modular data centers get manufactured, they get transported to a particular location, so they can be commissioned, hooked up to utilities like super fast. And it can even be for a relatively short duration. A perfect example would be, let's say, for a country that's hosting the Olympics, and they need a bunch of modular data centers in place for a period of a month or two, before, during, and a little bit afterwards. That's the perfect scenario where you'd bring modular data centers in, or the US Open, or the Super Bowl, or World Cup, or whatever kind of sporting events where it takes place over a couple of days or a week or two leading up, and you'd need that there for a week or two leading afterwards. Perfect scenario where you wouldn't build a data center on site for that particular location. Disaster recovery areas, business continuity, disaster recovery is another perfect application for modular data centers. And that's very different than edge, because edge data centers are built permanently at a particular fixed location. They don't tend to get moved around. And again, when it comes to edge, you're typically marketing it towards distance sensitive applications like IoT, electric vehicles, smart cities, AI, latency sensitive, distance sensitive applications and or governance related reasons, and they tend to be smaller than traditional co-location data centers. But what's quite different with modular versus edge is modular can be transported. Edge is built like a typical data center, except it tends to be much smaller. Sometimes it's repurposed out of something. So typically when I see modular and edge together, it means that they're trying to figure out a way to speed time to market, to speed delivery. I talked to someone on the podcast a couple of weeks ago who was using the word modular in the context of data centers that were powered by hydrogen fuel cells as an alternate fuel source. And I went back and clarified what that founder was talking about. He said, no, this is completely different than modular data centers. It just means that we build this in such a way that capacity can be rolled out much faster, much more efficiently. It's very conducive to automation. It's very conducive to being able to run with less human labor, more systems. So in the course, when we think about modular edge data centers, it usually just means that they're trying to have a consistent approach to site selection, to design, to construction, to commissioning, provisioning, how it's managed, is they want to make sure that if their goal is to go from having 2 edge data centers today to having 40 edge data centers in a year or two, that by being very thoughtful and deliberate about the decisions that they make about design and implementation and commissioning, that it's I don't want to say it's prefabricated, but there's a lot to be said for driving a lot more efficiency through standardization, especially with complex supply chain and environment kind of things. So it's an edge data center provider that wants to just improve its marketing, and its attributes is they're more sustainable, they're more modular, and they're more scalable. So in terms of marketing, at the end of the day, we have to have a good feel for where you've been successful with these edge data centers. And like I've mentioned a few times, usually the buyers tend to be focused on a specific application where your precise location is incredibly important. In some cases, it is for governance reasons, but your marketing playbook, your go-to-market strategy will look a lot like any other part of being a data center operator, where you're trying to figure out what kind of clients are best suited for this based on the kind of clients that you've worked with in the past. In other words, you're looking for pattern recognition, muscle memory, so you can look at your existing happiest, most profitable clients that are sitting in your CRM system for your edge data center locations and say, oh, this is really interesting. When we look at our top 10 happiest, most profitable long-term edge data center clients, we found that they have these 2 or 3 things in common. And from there, you'll typically be able to figure out that, oh, okay, they're all clustered in a certain geographic region. They all tend to be a certain range of sizes. We thought we were doing well with enterprise, but no, we only have 1 or 2 enterprise clients. We tend to do better with mid-market. And oh yeah, this is really strange. We didn't anticipate this, but 50% of our clients are in biotech or pharmaceuticals, and another 30% of our clients are in telecommunications. Wow, we didn't realize it was that concentrated. And when you have great case studies, when you have great track record with selling and marketing and deploying and servicing and retaining into those industries, why not lean into doing a lot more of that with your lead generation, with your lead nurturing, with educating and building trust throughout the full journey. So once you have a lot of clarity about your business model and your competitive advantages and disadvantages, and you have a lot of clarity on the kind of clients that you've been most successful with, that have been happiest, that have stuck the longest, where you've been able to drive considerable account expansion, drive strong positive word of mouth, then the goal really is to try to clone and replicate those scenarios for your top of funnel, middle of the funnel, bottom of the funnel throughout that full journey. So geographically figure out where they're located, how big or small their companies are, and certain industries where you've done better than others. And then from there, within those accounts, who are the people that have been most influential, have the greatest economic impact on whether you move forward or whether the deal stalls out and stays with you the longest. So your most important economic stakeholder, we'll call him or her the primary buyer persona. The second most important, third most important could be your secondary and tertiary buyer persona. And for each of those personas, we need to get into what's going on in their worlds. what's going on a day in the life of that particular person. So we need strong consensus on what their biggest five or six biggest goals are that they're working on professionally. These are things that would likely show up in job descriptions, that they'd be tracking in their objectives and key results and their OKRs. They're things that they just talk about all the time because that's essentially what they're focused on trying to achieve individually, among their team, and as a company. And then the flip side of the goals is the other side of the coin is, are the challenges? What are they struggling with the most? What's driving them nuts? What's stressing them out to no end? What are those 5 or 6 biggest stressors that are directly or indirectly related to someone that needs digital infrastructure? That it could be a leading indicator that they're going to be in market for edge data center capacity in the coming days, in the coming weeks, and in the coming months. And the better job you do of understanding those 10 or 12 leading indicators, like a handful of different goals, a handful of different challenges, and understanding those specifically in their own words, the better job you can do with having marketing and having copywriting and having branding that really, really resonates with what is top of mind for that most important kind of stakeholder. And then you repeat the same research exercise with the same customer insight gathering exercise with your secondary, potentially your tertiary buyer persona. In the case of edge data centers, if you're selling to smaller companies, you may be trying to get all the way to like a CTO or a VP of digital infrastructure, network engineering. If you're selling to larger companies, you'll have a more granular kind of set of personas to build out. It's super common among data center operators, even edge, where you'll have relationships with channel partners like managed service providers, MSPs, network integrators, IT consultancies, perhaps master agents. You may even have relationships with real estate agents. And each of these segments cares about different issues. And when you get the consensus on that, that should be largely what is driving a lot of your marketing, your lead generation, your lead nurturing, your educating and building trust initiatives and priorities around each of those segments. Because what you've discovered for that CTO, what you've discovered for that channel partner, what you've discovered for that VP of IT infrastructure, whatever it is, their words should drive what you decide to do for the headline on the website page. That's just for that particular segment. What you talk about in the first couple of paragraphs and in the bullet points for that particular segment. What's in your lead magnet, your downloadable premium content offer for that particular segment. What topics, what titles that you decide to focus on for the events, the educational events that you're going to host for each of those buyer personas, one segment at a time, regardless of whether we're talking about virtual events like webinars and live streams and online summits, whether we're talking about in-person events like breakfast seminars, lunch and learns, and things like that, or all of the above. That client centricity, that customer centricity is incredibly important, because at the end of the day, for you to thrive in the self-driven buyer's journey, where nearly all of the researching and comparing options and evaluating pricing for edge computing now happens without you in the room, we need to figure out a way for you and your marketing team and your sales team to get in early and to get in often, to earn a seat on their side of the table. And the best way to do it is we got to get you out of the vendor box, and we got to keep you out of the vendor box. And the most effective way to do this for this particular kind of business model, for this particular kind of buyer personas, for this particular kind of self-driven journey, is we need to figure out a way for your client-facing team members to be involved in their professional development and their learning and development process, to the extent that they are taking valuable hours, valuable days out of their schedule several times a year to learn from your client-facing team members, to learn from your internal and your external subject matter experts about topics that are top of mind for them, that help them do their job better, to help them more effectively achieve their individual, their team, and their company's professional goals, to help them overcome some of the biggest struggles, stresses, challenges that are driving them nuts, that are screwing up their peace of mind, messing with their work-life balance, taking away their ability to unplug and have true vacations. To the extent that you are able to, on an ongoing basis, like once a month, invite them to come learn from your experts, magical things will happen. with driving lead generation, with driving alignment across multiple stakeholders from that same company, and starting to not only be able to identify all the different pieces of the decision committee, but one by one drive alignment across multiple stakeholders from that company's decision committee in their formative stages when it's early enough to still have a massive impact on the criteria that they establish for what they're ultimately going to do to select what their direction they're going in for edge computing early and often. And when you do that really, really well, you stay on the short list, you start to proactively knock competitors off of the short list because these prospects and clients are spending so much time learning from you that you're starving their attention for their ability to have a need to spend that kind of time with anyone else. Because again, we're getting you out of being seen as a vendor and you're being seen more as a way that they're learning to do their job better by introducing them to best practices for how other professionals and other similar sized companies and similar geographic regions and similar industries are approaching these exact same issues that are leading indicators that someone's going to be making a major decision around edge data center capacity in the coming days, weeks, or months. So that's what I'd be thinking about for how a sustainable, modular, and scalable edge data center provider can improve its marketing. Okay, what do we got up next? By the way, if you're getting good value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button to help spread the word, share the love, and let others know about this resource. Next question up is, how does this is a good one, investors. We actually don't get to talk about investors that often on the show, so I'm glad this question came up. How does a data center infrastructure VC, venture capital investment firm, find early adopters for new technologies? How does a data center infrastructure VC firm, venture capital investment firm, find early adopters for new technologies? That is a terrific question. And I think it's ones that people that have never worked for an early stage VC-backed company may not have ever seen or had experience with. So what's super interesting is when you think about venture capital firms, that they tend to get involved earlier than private equity firms would, but it's similar kind of idea. They take a strong vested interest in their portfolio company's success. And depending on how strong of an interest they take and how much relevant experience that the board members that come from that VC firm that are now on that particular company's board take in the long-term success of that particular client, you'll see varying degrees of interest in the VC firm getting involved in helping to support their clients. But it actually is very common that when you look at VC firms that specialize in digital infrastructure and data centers and data center infrastructure, that they look to invest in companies that they understand well. So the second part of that is when they look at companies that they understand well, because they tend to be concentrated in certain niches. In an ideal scenario, they look for companies that could potentially have a lot of potential for collaborating together, either through partnerships, through joint development agreements, through co-marketing, or perhaps even merging together, rolling them up, because there'd be a lot more efficiencies where 1 + 1 equals way more than 3. So with that in mind, it's very common to find that the VC, either the limited partner, the lead person in that relationship, or who takes a board seat, whether they do this or whether they have team members that work for them that do this, or all the above, it's actually very common to find VCs that put on professional development and networking opportunities specifically for their portfolio companies. That's where marketers from the same VC's portfolio companies get to meet other marketers from other portfolio companies that have that common investor. And same thing with sales professionals, same thing with CEOs, same thing with founders, because what they're trying to do is not only cross-pollinate sharing of ideas, they're trying to cross-pollinate common professional development, business development opportunities, planting the seeds for maybe these companies should be doing a lot more together and may actually end up getting married at some point in the future, merging the two companies together. So it's quite common to find that a limited partner in a VC firm will task someone that works for them with helping a little bit with business development, with at least going through employees, friends and family members of employees and professional connections of employees, and trying to facilitate introduction. So let's say, for example, that the limited partner, that lead partner on their account, has worked at 5 different companies over the last 15 years. And in aggregate across those 5 companies, they have 50 people that they've been really close with. And they figured that with their 2 or 3 portfolio companies, of those 50 former coworkers, as many as half of them could be prospects for some of their portfolio companies. And then they have like a marketing director or a business development person or something that works for the VC firm who essentially works for the LP. And they say, oh, okay, you've worked at 7 different places over the last 20 years. And among those 7 places, you have 35 former coworkers. How many of those coworkers could be a fantastic fit for some of their portfolio companies? So they're going through their personal connections, both from the folks that are on the board and people that work for that at the VC firm. And they're looking to see where they could facilitate introductions for potential early adopters of new technology. Because we know when it comes to early adopters, there's certain kinds of personas, there's certain kinds of stakeholders, IT professionals, that are warmer to that idea of being on the leading or bleeding edge than others. And there's others that are way more risk averse. As they've known people in their former jobs, they probably have a pretty good sense as the people that always want to be keeping up with and learning about new potential disruptive technology. So they'll facilitate personal introductions to that. In some cases as well, the VC firms will host not only events where there's chances for the members of portfolio companies to get to meet and mingle with and learn and grow with each other, but they'll actually host conferences where their portfolio companies will have booths and will have a chance to speak. And in a particular city, in a particular region, they'll invite and host a conference where there's common personas that would be interested in multiple companies that are within their portfolio. So let's say, for example, you have a VC firm that's invested in a DSIM company, data center infrastructure management software. They've invested in a company that's doing IoT for facility managers, and they have a company that's doing something for robotics with managing data centers. So they have these 3 different companies, and they don't compete with each other. They're very complementary to each other. But what they all have in common is they all want to get in front of more data center managers, more data center facility managers, more CTOs of small to mid-sized co-location operators. So the portfolio manager says, great, well, instead of us giving, I don't know, for argument's sake, $250,000 a year or your local currency equivalent to each of those 3 companies, rather than us spending that $750,000 and you're all going your own separate ways, why don't we take half of that or a third of that, and we'll host a small conference in New York or London or Singapore or whatever, or we'll invite like 200 people that we think would be fantastically interested in this topic. It won't look like a traditional conference with multiple tracks. It'll be a single session kind of event where, you know, it's a single track event throughout the day. But this will give our portfolio companies a chance to put some of their smartest minds, their subject matter experts, in front of some hand-curated, hand-invited people from the technology community that could be interested in what they're doing with infrastructure management software, what they're doing with robotics, what they're doing with IoT, among their 3 different kinds of portfolio companies. So it's a little bit of show and tell, a lot of educating and building trust, positioning as thought leaders. So these are some of the ways in which a VC firm that's specializing, a venture capital firm that's specializing in data center infrastructure, could take a strong interest in helping its client, helping its portfolio companies find early adopters for new technologies. There's word of mouth. There's hosting in-person events. They could host virtual events. They could host podcast interviews. They could do all of the above. But many, many times when founders pick the right VC to partner with, and it should be a mutual process where the founders are picking the VC just as much as the VCs are picking the founders. When there's a really good match and everyone's interests are aligned in the same general direction, it is very, very common to find the limited partners, to find the venture capital firm that's super interested in facilitating these introductions and lead generation and positioning kind of opportunities for not just one of their portfolio companies, but multiple portfolio companies that share common, that have basically total addressable market, TAM, ideal client profile, ICP overlap, and share some common personas where it would really, really behoove these companies to build some common pipeline together. So that's the third question that we'll be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. With that, we're going to take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And when we come back in the second half of this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll tackle 3 more of the biggest questions that we're hearing about from all over data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com. Now, back to Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A.
Hey there, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and you're watching our weekly live show, the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments in wherever you are watching from. So what do we have up next? Our next question, our next topic that we're going to be addressing has to do with a different kind of data center operator. We talked earlier about edge data center operators, which tend to be relatively small in footprint in hyper-specific areas. At the other extreme of edge data center operators are hyperscale data center operators that tend to be massive. And this question in particular, this viewer wants to know, how does a hyperscale data center operator effectively acquire clients? How do hyperscale data center operators effectively acquire clients? And that is a fantastic question, because the context of being a hyperscale data center operator is quite different than being just a colocation operator or edge or modular or wholesale. It's probably has more in common with being a wholesale data center operator, data center developer than some of the other categories. But what's unique about hyperscale is you're typically selling huge deals. You're typically selling huge amounts of square footage, square meters, and power. And in some cases, you're selling this deal in such a large block that you end up with like a single tenant as opposed to multi-tenant, where like one blue chip, one anchor tenant takes the entire facility or takes multiple buildings on a campus. So with that in mind, what you tend to find is for these large hyperscale deals, because the companies tend to be considerably larger, that have deep enough pockets to be able to invest in this kind of infrastructure, which in most cases, in most markets, are 7 or 8 figure investments or your local currency equivalent. When you figure out who has the budget to be able to sign up for these huge hyperscale agreements in a dozen, 2 dozen, and perhaps dozens of different geographic markets globally, you realize that you're getting into that rarefied stratosphere of really, really large IT infrastructure related companies, and some of which you likely know. They're very well known. They'd be companies like AWS, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, Oracle, Meta, Alibaba, Netflix. These are huge, huge hyperscale kind of companies that are, when they approach data center operators, they're not looking to just get a couple dozen servers, a couple of racks, a couple cabinets. They're typically looking for thousands of square feet, thousands of meters, dozens of megawatts at a time or more. So with that in mind, what you tend to have is when you look at your ideal client profile, geographically, they could be literally on the other side of the planet and just happen to have a need in your geographic market where you're building this hyperscale facility or where you have this capacity coming along with a hyperscale facility. In terms of their size, they tend to be much larger companies. It's relatively rare to find a startup-y kind of or scale-up-y kind of size company that many would consider a hyperscaler. Usually these are Fortune 1000, Fortune 5000 size companies. So they're going to have thousands or tens of thousands, maybe even more than that, maybe hundreds of thousands of employees. And then as an end result of that, your target account list will be a lot more concentrated than it would be if you were just in the business of being a co-location operator or an edge operator, meaning that you could literally have a couple handfuls of companies on your target account list. And that pretty much tells you what you'd reasonably expect as who the tenants or tenants would be for your hyperscale data center facility or facilities in that particular geographic market. So what that means is these are huge deals. It's a lot more concentrated. And as a result, the good part is your unit economics are so outrageously high that you can afford to invest in a lot of marketing and sales, client acquisition investments that would never be profitable to do for selling SMB, small and medium-sized business co-location deals, or small and medium-sized or even mid-market kind of edge computing deals. Because hyperscale, again, these are massive. So what does that mean? In practice, this is where you see companies that are selling hyperscale deals go and have a major splash at national and global conferences. And by major splash, they're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, euros, whatever the local currency equivalent is, by not just taking a booth, but by bringing in 5, 10, 15 people from your team, sponsoring an epic cocktail party, one night, sponsoring a massive golf tournament, ridiculous amounts of money being spent on swag, no stone left unturned. So that you can afford to do those kinds of things. But what I would also encourage you to do is to lean into the self-driven buyer's journey. We now live in a world where most of your highly technical, highly educated, largely skeptical, largely anti-sales marketing IT professionals that you're selling into, they want to be in the driver's seat. They've said this loud and clear for a really long time. We're now in a place where Gartner found and Forrester has confirmed largely the same thing. We've confirmed largely the same thing. Nearly all of the journey is over before you get to meet prospects and clients for hyperscale. Gartner puts that number at 83%, where 83% of research and comparing options and evaluating pricing now happens without you being in the room. This is a really big challenge, but it's a big opportunity for the account executives and sales development reps for hyperscale data center operators that are able to get in early and often. The way to get in early and often isn't by spending more money on golf tournaments and cocktail parties and all these, taking more people to professional sporting events and concerts. And you're building some affinity that way, but what's not being accomplished in that context is educating and building trust. And in order for you to earn your way in and get out of that vendor box and be seen more in a professional development, in a learning and development context, educating and building trust becomes a super important part of that. So when you understand, like for a hyperscale data center deal, whether you care more about getting in with the data center, the vice president of construction, data center development, infrastructure, CTO, investors, CFO, there's a lot of different stakeholders that get involved in these huge deals. And the biggest of big deals, the interesting part when it comes to these large hyperscale deals is going back 5 or 10 years ago, it used to be that getting to the CTO was the holy grail. And yes, the CTO is still an important part of this in most companies. But when you're starting to talk about multi-million, several million kind of deals, in most cases, this is going all the way to the board. So the CTO is sitting at the table, but so is the CEO and so is the rest of the board. So on these hyperscale deals, understanding who is on the decision committee, it's a lot of stakeholders to win over, and they care about many different issues. So how can you earn your way in early and often about with 3, 4, 5 or more different kinds of stakeholders that look at the hyperscale decision quite differently? Well, segment your lead generation, segment your nurturing. So when you're looking to build relationships with CFOs, CTOs, CEOs, board members in these companies, that you're talking about the 5 or 6, 5 or 10 biggest goals and challenges that you know are top of mind for each category of that stakeholder. That's a leading indicator that they're going to be in market for hyperscale in the near future, in the coming weeks or in the coming months. Getting in early, getting in often is largely a function of providing unique value to them, hyper relevant value that they just can't get anywhere else. And in most cases, in this huge enterprise context, to be successful with that, you're almost certainly going to need one or more people on your internal team who are subject matter experts for that particular buyer persona. So, CFOs want to talk to other CFOs, CTOs want to talk to other CTOs, board members want to talk to other board members. And the closer you are to that precise context, where there's a reasonable geographic match, where there's a reasonable industry match, where there's a reasonable company size match, the more they're interested in being able to register, participate in these educational opportunities. Because the goal is early and often. You want the value to be so high that these stakeholders are not only motivated to attend, but they're motivated to bring multiple people from their team along with them. And they're motivated to keep coming back and learning from you to the point where it becomes a no-brainer that you have some of the smartest people on the planet when it comes to being a hyperscale operator. In other words, they are shifting a significant amount of their professional development and learning development for these topics to learning from your company. When you do that, you're not only on the short list, you stay on the short list throughout the full journey. You get unique insights about what's really going on inside of these companies, because they don't see you as a vendor anymore. They see you as a teacher and they see you as an expert. And in many cases, the competitive options start to drop off the short list because they're just getting so much value from your company that there's really they're not going to be able to get that comparable kind of vibe, positioning kind of relationship with others. So if you have internal subject matter experts that line up well with this, great. If not, look to your channel partners, look to some vendors, look to some other companies you have relationships with where you could bring them in and moderate panels, guest speakers, what have you. But at the end of the day, the goal is to understand who the different 2, 3, 4 different kinds of stakeholders are and invest in building very deep roots with that individual and providing so much value that they're highly motivated to bring multiple team members along with them. So when it comes to acquiring clients, understand where you've been most successful in the past, geographically, what sizes, what industries, what stakeholders have been most receptive to your offer, your value proposition, your positioning, your unique competitive advantages, and then lean into figuring out to get a way to get in early and often within each of those segments. So by the time they're at that last 5%, 10% of their journey, and they're truly in market, that you have planted the seeds so deep that it's nearly impossible for other competitive forces to derail that deal from happening. And your context of how you do this will vary depending on your size and their size and your business model and your unique competitive advantages and how much of a mature established market you're in versus a emerging market. There's a lot of different factors that come into play. But at the end of the day, it's about educating and building trust that's hyper specific to who each of these stakeholders are, what's going on in their world, and how you can add a lot of value to the 5 or 10 topics that may be directly or indirectly related to a upcoming major considered purchase decision for hyperscale data center facilities with the hyperscale data center operator. So that's how hyperscale data center operators can effectively acquire clients. If you're getting good value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure you help spread the word by hitting the like button on whatever platform that you're watching from. Okay, what do we have up next? What's our next question? This one's an interesting part of the data center ecosystem that I don't know if we've ever talked about before, or at least we don't talk about very often. This is in the facilities part of the ecosystem, particularly raised flooring that goes in data centers and data halls. And with this in mind, how does a data center raised flooring company improve its sales and marketing messages? How does a data center raised flooring company improve its sales and marketing messages? That is a terrific question. And I'm going to start by putting a disclaimer out there that I'm going to spare you of the dad jokes that would come along with people coming up with mediocre sales and marketing messages that will allow a raised flooring company to get walked all over. I warned you. So with that in mind, how does a raised flooring company that could be considered a commoditized part of the data center ecosystem improve its sales and marketing message? I think a lot of what this comes down to is we need your client-facing team members to be seen as the be-all end-all experts on anything and everything that's directly and indirectly related to raised flooring. So whether you're sponsoring a raised flooring academy or raised flooring training and certification program or facilities related training events for all the different categories of facility related investments that are adjacent to flooring, whether you're getting a lot more dialed into being client centric to truly understand who these ideal clients are, who these stakeholders are in these companies and what they're really dealing with on a daily basis. I think there's a lot to be said for leading with educational resources and educational events. So for a data center flooring company, I think the first thing to be really self-aware of is where you historically have done better than others. Where have you done well, where other companies in your space have struggled, and vice versa. And that self-awareness more than likely manifests itself in your CRM, your customer relationship management system, with who are the most profitable, longest term, happiest clients. It will likely pop up on your testimonials, your reviews, your case studies section. But what do these companies have in common? For when it comes to your raised flooring, selling into data center facilities, do you tend to do better with enterprise data centers like end users? Do you tend to do better with co-location operators? Do you tend to do well with hyperscale operators? Do you have a unique edge with edge operators? Like, which of these categories do you have 50% plus of your revenue coming from, 50% plus of your profit coming from, where it's really become a strong core competence? When you've figured that out, it becomes a lot easier to dial into getting your sales and marketing message right, because instead of trying to come up with one go-to-market strategy, one communication strategy, one lead generation and sales enablement kind of strategy that resonates with lots of different segments, you're able to attract this. You were able to go after this one particular segment at a time with an approach that resonates really, really deeply with that particular segment. So just dialing into what I was just talking through before, let's say you've done your homework and you figure out that you've done really, really well with mid-market enterprise data centers, mid-market companies that have their own data centers, specifically within financial services and hospitals. And you've also done well with small co-location operators with 3 locations or less. So we just identified 3 different segments. We identified enterprises in 2 different industries, and we identified small size co-location operators. So when you've identified those 3 different segments, the 2 end user segments and enterprise segments and 1 co-location operator segment, what I want you to do is prioritize which has had the biggest economic impact, the biggest financial impact on your company. The one with the most important impact, we'll call your primary buyer persona. The one with the secondary buyer persona. The number 3 on the list would be your tertiary buyer persona. So, and within each of those segments, what do they have in common at the company level? The enterprises may be considerably large. The mid-market companies may be considerably larger than the co-location operator, just by nature of how we're describing those. So like when it comes to the 2 different segments of mid-market companies that have their own data centers, what do they have in common geographically? Where do they tend to be located? What size are those companies? Do they have that in common? And are there certain, and the industries we already covered, so that's for sure a big issue. With the co-location operators, what do they have in common? We talked about how they tend to be on the small side with 3 locations or less. That probably maps into something like 11 to 50 employees or something similar to that? And are there certain industries that tend to do better than others, or are they just located in a particular geographic region? And what they tend to have in common is they're all 11 to 50 employees with 1 to 3 locations. So once we have those 3 segments in mind, within each of those 3 segments, we now know who the stakeholder is, essentially, that we need to build a deep relationship with, where we need our sales and marketing message to really resonate. And in order to resonate, we have to talk about what they care about, not what we care about or what we want them to care about at some point, but what they care about right now, meeting them where they are right now. And the way we do that is to become very client-centric, very customer-centric, so that we look at one segment at a time and we interview 5 or 10 representative people in each of those segments, either face-to-face or on a Zoom or by phone, or we do surveys. We looked at their search and social footprint. Essentially, what we need to get to the point is, in each of those segments, the primary, secondary, and tertiary buyer persona, what their biggest goals are and what their biggest challenges are when it comes to anything and everything related to data center facilities management, because that's the category in which you exist as a raised flooring company. You're in the facilities part of the data center ecosystem. And what you may discover is, with 5 or 6 big goals or 5 or 6 big challenges that they're dealing with, among those 10 or 12 things, raised flooring may either not come up at all or may only come up 1 or 2 times. And that's okay, because these are all leading indicators that this particular kind of person is going to be in market for upgrading, replacing, adding on to raised flooring at some point in the near future. By the way, you may also discover that in addition to, or in lieu of, one of those 3 segments, you may discover that there's like a channel partner context that could be fantastic for your company that sells raised flooring. For example, someone that's involved in commissioning data centers or doing build outs, like, what do they call it, an EPC kind of company, a general contractor, supply chain, that gets involved in new construction and retrofits. They may also be in a great position to drive awareness of your educational resources that are sponsored by one of the most forward-looking data center flooring companies in the industry. But at the end of the day, by getting really client-centric on their biggest goals and challenges, and making sure that our website copywriting and our product marketing and our sales enablement and our email and our social, and most of all our events, are aligned around the topics that are top of mind, we put ourselves in a fantastic position to create awareness and educate and build trust with potential clients anywhere from a couple of weeks to a couple of months ahead of a considered purchase decision around data center flooring. And as I alluded to at the beginning of answering this question as well, it's very possible that you find fantastic co-marketing opportunities, like for joint events, joint podcasts, joint webinars with other marketing and sales professionals in adjacent categories that all sell to the same kind of mid-market companies with their own data centers, or smaller co-location operators, or data center general contractors. Again, you're all trying to get awareness in front of that same kind of company. And who would some of those adjacent categories be to raised flooring? I don't know. At DCSMI, we catalog about a dozen different companies that are involved in various aspects of facilities management. So we look at commissioning and decommissioning companies, power and cooling companies, physical security companies, the infrastructure part of management, electricity, be more on the power side, plumbing. There's a lot of different kinds of companies that interact with data center facilities managers that don't sell raised flooring, and you are not involved in their category. But what you tend to have in common is, when you get 2, 3, 4 different segments all together, and you put this together in a single educational resource, in a single breakfast seminar series, webinar series, podcast series, whatever have you, is there's enormous amount of potential synergies across these different kinds of companies. But what it largely comes down to is getting really client-centric, getting really customer-centric, and understanding not just what their interest is in your category that you want to be able to monetize and commercialize at some point in the near future, but playing the long game. What does it take to get in early, and what does it take to get in there often, by figuring out a way for you and your client-facing team members to have significant surface area, significant footprint in their full buyer's journey in whatever project that they're working on that's a leading indicator that they're going to be making a decision around data center flooring in the coming weeks or in the coming months. So that's the general idea of what I would focus on if you're trying to improve the relevancy, to improve the value, to improve the pulling power, the effectiveness of your sales and marketing messages for a company that is in data center raised flooring. Is lead with education, lead with building trust. So by the time they're at that final stage of the journey, you already have done wonders to build up the know, like, and trust. You have done wonders to shape the criteria that they use to make their purchase decisions across multiple stakeholders in the company with not only raised flooring, but many, many other categories of considered purchase decisions that go into modern data center facilities. So that's how I would approach how a data center raised flooring can improve its sales and marketing messages. And again, I warned you about this before, so it doesn't get walked all over. Sorry, couldn't resist. So trying to keep it light here. Okay, so that brings us to our final question for the data center go-to-market sales and marketing Q&A show. By the way, again, if you have a topic or challenge or stress that you're dealing with in your company that you think would be a prime topic for an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're watching, and we'll add that to the consideration queue for an upcoming episode. Okay, what do we have as our final question? Just take a look real quick here at the comments. Okay, final question is, this is interesting. This is a segment of the data center ecosystem that we really also don't get to talk about very often. This is in the outsourced sales and marketing part of the data center industry. So just to review again for context, we at DCSMI, we segment the data center industry into the data center operators, data center technology companies, data center facilities related companies. We put data center construction, real estate, and investment together because they're so closely joined at the hip for segment number 4. And segment number 5 is outsourced sales and marketing. And outsourced sales and marketing are like agencies, outsourced sales consultancies, media companies, events companies. We actually consider recruiters a really important part of outsourced sales and marketing as well. Training in many cases can be part of that, although usually the training anchors a little more closely with facilities and technology. Brokers, not real estate brokers, but more like full-time channel partners or consulting firms that are paid primarily through revenue share, through channel partner commissions. We definitely like manufacturers, reps, distributors, are also for sure a huge part of the outsourced sales and marketing ecosystem within data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure. So this particular question is about marketing and communications agency, probably pretty similar like what most people would consider a PR agency. So how does a data center digital marketing and communications agency build data center community awareness? How does a data center digital marketing and communications agency build data center community awareness? Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So I'm going to answer it 2 different ways. The first way is how they're actually doing this and how I would recommend doing this a little bit differently. So a data center digital marketing and communications agency is typically providing outsourced marketing and PR and communications related services to clients throughout the data center ecosystem as an extension of their internal marketing team. So usually, and when it comes to like being a marketing agency or communications agency, there's all different sizes, all the way from like freelancers, like one-person micro agencies, to huge agencies with hundreds or even in some cases thousands of employees. The agencies that tend to be most specialized in data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure tend to be more small to mid-size. I don't have perfect data on it, but anecdotally, what I tell you is most of these firms are usually a few dozen employees. Maybe some of the larger ones are closing in on like 100+ employees. But what you tend to find is that most of the firms that deeply specialize in this niche are usually going to be in the double digits in terms of number of employees, like somewhere between 11 and 50, or maybe up to 80 or 100 employees before they hit the point where there's a lot of inefficiencies that come up with getting to that next level or having to turn away a lot of smaller clients because your minimums go up so much. So within that context, how are they building community awareness? Most of the agencies that are in the space are building community awareness because they're very deeply embedded in the data center conference ecosystem. And by very deeply embedded, in most cases, a lot of companies in that category are marketing partners, media sponsors, media partners of major data center conferences. And the way that typically works is the marketing agency, the communications, the PR agency is bartering services for exposure. So a lot of times what this means is they're willing to do email blasts to their prospects and their clients lists to promote an upcoming event. What's even more valuable to the big media and events companies is in many cases, the owners, the principals of these marketing communications agencies have massive pull with the executives of these companies to influence where these companies choose to attend, speak at, and exhibit. In other words, like in addition to having professional services retainers that in most cases are 6 figures plus, or your local currency equivalent, depending on which part of the world you do business in. In addition to that, the owners, the principals of these companies also have massive influence where their clients choose to submit speaking proposals and speak at, where they choose to attend at, as well as even where they choose to exhibit and sponsor at. So there's a lot of synergies, a lot of potential mutual interest between those two ways, some of which are more transparent than others. So the agency a lot of times is bartering their access to their prospects and clients, which is super interesting to the media and events companies, because if they didn't have those relationships with those media companies, with those sponsor companies, they would have to buy ads. So what we've also seen over the last 5 or 10 years is the emergence of a lot of these marketing and communications companies setting up their own media brands, independent of their own agency brands, to try to align themselves to be a lot more like a media partner than just an agency. So they'll set up, it used to be 10 years ago, it was super common to set up like a separate website, blog, kind of like trade publication that was owned and operated by the agency that would primarily focus on getting visibility for their clients, except it would be multiple clients together. Every once in a while, they would likely drop in some exposure for prospects that they were courting. So it was like the top of their funnel. And over the time, what we've seen over the last 5-6 years is agencies also bringing podcasting, interview-based podcasting into that ecosystem as well. So they're building adjacent brands, a secondary brand to their agency to essentially build a media company. So they're on par with other media companies so they can barter this relationship with agencies. We've also noticed in the last couple of years that a lot of the predominant marketing, communications, PR agencies in this space are building a cause-related platform in addition to like a traditional brand. Like one agency that's known really well in this space has one that's focused on recruiting students to be to join the data center industries for their careers. Another one is focused on sustainability. So this is beyond just a traditional media platform. It's a cause, it's a mission, and it's one in which they find a relatively, I don't know if it's an easy time getting their clients to rally around, but certainly they find like-minded people are like, oh yeah, for sure. We want to protect the future of this industry by getting young people to see these career opportunities as fun and exciting and lucrative in the future. Oh yeah, for sure. We want to protect the planet from imploding and the whole industry from imploding by focusing on more sustainable data centers. So yeah, you see this emergence of these co-marketing media sponsor relationships. You see the setting up of separate brands that started as blogs like 10 years ago and now have morphed into more podcasting and some webinars that put them on par with like a smaller version of a larger, more dedicated media company. And then you see these cause-related type of approaches. So that's for sure. Those are 3 big ways that agencies are building data center community awareness. And like, as I mentioned, when I started answering this question, that's what I observe is actually going on. Where I think there's some holes, where I think there's some gaps in that strategy for these companies to grow a lot more aggressively, as a lot of these mid-sized PR marketing communications agencies are very dependent on top of funnel, middle of funnel coming from these relationships that they have with conferences. And it's not just the sponsorships, it's that a lot of the services, the professional services that they're selling to the media companies, that they're selling to their clients, are about gaining access, their clients gaining access to potentially lucrative, scarce speaking opportunities at these conferences and visibility opportunities on these companies' blogs, podcasts, newsletters, what have you. So it's not so much that that some of the media companies are setting up an environment where there's like editorial earned and pay to play, but in a lot of ways, the marketing and communications and PR agencies kind of become like a service provider that's an extension to helping companies get more out of their data center conference ecosystem investment. Now, I'm not aware of any data center or market research firms that have come up with any concrete numbers on the massive amount of investment that happens globally with data center conferences, but we know there's dozens of major data center digital infrastructure critical facilities conferences globally, dozens of major ones, and there's hundreds of smaller ones. And the last time we asked the LLM tools for their opinion on this topic, the general idea, and this was as recently as a couple of weeks ago, is that there may be as much as $400 or $500 million a year, US or your local currency equivalent, being spent on data center industry conferences, like $500 million a year being spent on data center industry conferences. So to the extent that there's marketing agencies, PR agencies, communications agencies that are helping clients tap into that, this is a massive market. And just to put that in context, in that same query, we asked, okay, what else do people spend money on in the data center industry that's anywhere near that ballpark? And one of the things that came up was like UPSs, uninterruptible power supplies, battery backup units for standby power supplies. So I don't remember whether conferences was a little bigger or a little smaller than that, but just the idea that there's such a massive amount being spent on attending, exhibiting, sponsoring, speaking at, entertaining at these national and global conferences, that it rivals something in that category, like standby power solutions, battery backup solutions, UPSs, and data centers globally, that it's even in that same conversation set is insane. And I think that's a huge, huge part of the reason why the data center marketing agencies, PR agencies, communications are in demand, is because there are still a significant amount of hundreds or thousands of companies in this ecosystem that are not only looking for creating awareness in some of these walled garden ecosystems, but they're looking for validation. And when you're investing in sending multiple people from your company, and when you're earning some of these scarce speaking slots, whether they're solo speaking slots, keynotes, or shared in the context of a panel, or where you're exhibiting, essentially you're renting access to being under that brand halo for a certain period of time. If it's a 3-day conference, the renting of access under that brand halo peaks in its intensity in the 3 days of the conference. But you also are riding along on that brand halo for the weeks and the months leading up. When you see your LinkedIn company page, when you see your social media, when you see all of the individuals that work for your company constantly sharing titles, announcing that you're going to be at this conference, sharing that conference's logo, sharing that conference's branding, and encouraging people to visit your talk, schedule a meeting, visit your booth. Part of what you're investing in isn't just that that conference organizer has a captive audience. And as we move to a self-driven journey where it's increasingly difficult to get access to that captive audience, the cost and value of that attention could still continue to go up and go up and up and escalate quite sharply, even though in many cases you're not investing in educating and building trust, you're just creating awareness. So there's that, you're renting access to that brand in the months and weeks leading off, and you're even getting a tail residual effect of that because of the FOMO kinds of posts that most people share that have a shelf life of usually, at least not only during the conference, but for several days or in some cases a couple of weeks after the event has taken place, where you're sharing your photos and everyone's looking like they're having a fantastic time having drinks together, and you're mentioning all your friends that you were hanging out with and everything. Part of, again, what you're investing in isn't just the captive audience, isn't just that you were paying to get access to the product, the captive audience that's at the event, is that you're paying to be associated with renting access to that credentialing, renting access to the affinity with that particular brand. and where I think a lot of professional services firms in this industry are selling themselves short is I would recommend that you promote and build your brand to be even significantly stronger than the conference organizer's brand, because you're selling to clients that are very, very sensitive to this brand halo effect and buying into brands. And to the extent that the conference organizer's logo is an order of magnitude larger than yours in every single one of these contexts, where you're essentially subordinated below the conference events logos, you're selling yourself short. And a good way to think of this is a lot of you that know my background well know that before I started working in the data center space in the early 2010s, I'd worked with managed service providers, value-added resellers, IT consultancies, technology integrators for about 15 years before that. And in the early 2000s, when most of the companies in the space were building out kind of the 1.0 versions of their digital presence and their website and their social media, it was super common when I was doing website critiques to go through websites. And at the time, a lot of the people that I was advising were in the Microsoft channel partner ecosystem. And it was super common that from these relatively small companies, you'd look at a website and their credential that they earned by being part of the Microsoft Solution Provider Program or Partners Program, whatever it was at the time, that Microsoft's logo on their website was actually significantly larger than their own company's logo. And this wasn't just irony. This wasn't just metaphor. This was, they literally were seeing their role as being an extension of Microsoft or Cisco or IBM or Red Hat or whoever they were involved with at whatever channel partner programs they were involved with. They saw their company's role as being like almost a franchise of that, as being more valuable than building up their brand. And I said, wait a second, this is insanity. This is your visibility. This is your landing page. This is your premium content. This is your event. If you want to brag about the credentials that you have, the channel partners programs that you are part of, the associations that you're a member of, yeah, but for sure, their logo should not be bigger than yours. They probably shouldn't even be the same size as yours. They should be smaller than yours. And over time, this best practice has gone away just simply because savvy brand managers and marketing executives at companies would put guidelines in their brand books and their brand guides that said, thou shalt not have a vendor logo or association logo on a website page or on an ebook cover or slides or something, where the company's logo is bigger than our own logo. People for sure pay attention to that kind of thing. But that was a very common thing that we see, that we saw happening in early generations of people building out their initial websites and social media and digital presence. And we don't see that manifesting itself quite as often anymore, but we see the residual version of that happening among agencies, PR agencies, marketing agencies, communications agencies, where I think they're over-investing in trying to ride along with, in the back seat or in the trunk or on the roof of someone else's brand, and not spending enough time building a bigger car or a bigger SUV or a bigger luxury van with their own logo on it, primarily focusing on their own logo and their own brand. And if you don't think this is an issue, why do people pay for monument signage in retail or offices? Why are companies that rent one floor in a 10-story office building obsessed with who gets to put the sign on the top floor as that particular company building? Because they know branding really matters. So we're not just talking about logo placements. What we're talking about is getting out front with what you are about, your unique vision, your unique company value, to be significantly more important and significantly more front and center than just riding along as a service provider for the conferences that you partner with. So a little bit of a long answer there, but at a high level, when I look at how data center, digital marketing, and communications agencies are building community awareness, there's the way in which they're currently building community awareness with these media sponsorships, with having their own media properties, with influencing their clients. Like, that's all there. But I think the much bigger opportunity that most marketing agencies and communications agencies PR agencies are under investing in is like the shoemaker's kids always go barefoot, right? They always say that because you're spending so much time supporting your clients' unique marketing and communications and PR challenges that you're under investing in your firm's own. And I think that's where the biggest opportunity is to build more community awareness, is to get out from the shadow, to get out from trying to ride along in the back seat, in the trunk, on the roof of the truck, whatever, of what you perceive as some bigger brand, and build your own brand for your company to be more prominent. And I think in a self-driven buyer's journey, where people don't look to the page one of Google anymore to decide what they're going to click on, and where the LLMs, ChatGPT, Claude, Perplexity, Gemini, where they're not going to give you 10 options anymore. They're just going to pick the one that they want the most. Trust signals are incredibly important. And a lot of the activities that companies are using in the context of big media and events are trying to shortcut that, taking shortcuts to get there faster. The reality, though, is the LLM tools are going to get pretty good at understanding the difference between advertising and editorial. It's not a big secret anymore. And we're 20 years into the search and 25 years into the search engine results page. And they found, like in the early days, even in the early 2000s, the more educated a particular buyer was, the more they totally understood the difference between a Google ad and an organic search result. So for sure, of course, the AI-driven tools, the generative AI tools, understand the difference between buying your way in and earning your way in. And we know earning your way in, trust. Was it the EEAT thing that SEO people talk about, with authority, trust, experience? Like all of this is super, super important. And I think that's the biggest gap that I see among some of the incumbent data center marketing, data center PR, and data center communications agencies, is they're spending so much time on building up their clients and chasing these conference opportunities and living underneath the umbrella of these bigger conference organizers, that they're missing the opportunity to secure their futures by building a stronger brand for their company that's completely independent of the companies that they are partnering with. So that's how I would approach how a data center digital marketing and communications agency can build data center community awareness. So that's the final question that we're going to be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. Again, if you have an idea for a topic or a question or challenge that you'd like to see us addressing in an upcoming episode, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're watching, and we'll add that to the consideration queue for upcoming episodes. If you want to stay in the loop, if you want to get notified about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter, which you can do for free, and that comes to your email inbox on Sundays. You can sign up, you can subscribe on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. I'm Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. If you and I are not currently connected on LinkedIn and you'd like to be sure to send me a connect invitation and just mention that you watch the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, and I'd be happy to be a first-degree connection of yours. So that is our final question. That's this week's show. We look forward to seeing you back again next week, when we will address some of the biggest challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center critical facilities and digital infrastructure ecosystem, from operators, from tech, from facilities companies, from construction, real estate, and investment companies, and even outsourced sales and marketing companies. So we wish you great success in growing your impact, your team's impact, and your company's impact in and around data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. Take care now.
Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales marketing and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that's www.dcsmi.com.